Hello, and welcome to another edition of our Pocono Liars Club Zoom chat. This week, we're going to be talking about research for historical novels, for alternate historical novels, and just research in general, because no matter what you're writing, you're going to have to do some research if you want to write what you know. And our guest this week is Walter Hunt. So let's start by having Walter introduce himself to everybody.
Hi, everybody. I'm Walter Hunt. I'm a science fiction, historical fiction author. I live up in Massachusetts. I've been at this most of my life, professional, for almost 20 years, and I have 11 published novels and 10 published short stories. I write with Eric Flint in the 1632 universe and in the Arcane America universe, and I have my own science fiction series, and I have an ongoing series about mesmerism, which is a historical setting. And I have an alternate history novel that was published last summer, which looks like this. And, I'm glad to be here.
Oh, thank you.
And
for those who are not aware, my name is Michael Ventrella. I also have a bunch of novels out, some of which are with Eric Flint's press. I have some alternative history novels as well, so I'm going to be adding some comments here as well as long as we go on. But Walter, let's start by just talking about research in general when writing alternate histories. Tell us how you get yourself organized. How do you get started on this kind of stuff?
Well, it depends on the setting, and it depends on the style. Historical novels there's a wide variety of different kinds of historical novels, and I made a few notes about different kinds of things. There's straight historical novels, which don't have to necessarily have any kind of fantasy or science fiction element. My favorite 20th century novel is a historical novel. It's John Dos Passos's USA. Stories with a historical setting and some fantasy element or another kind. Paul Anderson wrote a number of them. Three Hearts and Three Lions, Midsummer Tempest, that sort of thing. There's all kinds of alternate history novels that depend on some fulcrum event changing. There's a whole bunch of, now there's a whole bunch of future history things. Robert Heinlein, James Blish, me. And there's fantasy history, which is something like J.R.R. Tolkien. And then there's parallel history, which is a whole sort of different category where things like Roman Empire in space or Weber's ongoing, slow-moving Lord Nelson equals Honor Harrington thing. In all of them, history has to make sense. And if you're going to do anything particularly set in a real historical setting, you got to go learn about it. What I generally do is one of two things. Either I have a subject I want to do, like when I was writing a 1632 novel, I read 6 biographies of Richelieu, at least 2 of which were good. And I've done all kinds of research for that. When I did my alternate history novel set in Russian California, the Russian version of California, my wife and I actually went out to Worldcon in California a couple of years ago, and we made a side trip up and went to Fort Ross, and I went to the Presidio, and I did a bunch of reading and bought a bunch of books. So I start with a subject, and then what happens is I do a lot of A Libris, a lot of JSTOR, a lot of just reading everything so I can consume everything, because I hate to do something that's completely contrary to what real history is. The other thing is I find some interesting subject and read a lot about it and then say, I bet I could write something there. So I start with the books and then go to the writing. But I have some rules about how I do it, and that's sort of a separate answer to a separate question. But basically, either I start with a bunch of things that I've read that make me interested in writing something, or I start with something that I want to write and do a bunch of reading. Ultimately, you have to do that, and you take a crap load of notes, and that's the way it is.
Well, we talk about writing what you know, and one of the reasons that's important. Too many new authors don't understand what that phrase means, because when you say write what you know, it doesn't mean write about a 61-year-old man who is a lawyer who lives in Stroudsburg.
Those words do not mean what you think they mean. Yeah.
Right. It means know it before you write it. Do your research is what it means, and too many people don't really get that. So you got to know what you're talking about, and that's because each of us is an expert in something, and you hate reading a story where they don't get it right. You just want to throw the book across the room.
That's probably the standard by which I throw things across the room. If in the first page, it's clear that they don't know the dates of things or the subjects of things or what people are like, across the room it goes. But you're absolutely right. you and people joke about it as well. I can't write about dragons because dragons don't exist. How could I know about dragons? Well, if the internal history of the book is consistent, then you know about dragons for your purposes. It's okay, but they better work consistently. You can't just make stuff up, unless you're Doctor Who. Then you could. Doctor Whoa.
But it's especially true, especially in science fiction, when they get the science wrong. That's the whole point of science fiction. If you get the
Yeah,
science
that's painful. But even fantasy, if you have a something which is unusual, like if magic is easy, there's lots of magic, then starvation is hard. Disease is hard, unless it's real bad disease or real bad starvation. Like there's everything is barren. If you're going to do it, even if it's not historical, and I know we're getting a little off topic here, but even if it's not historical, it has to be consistent, even if it's fantasy. So you have a certain obligation to do it right, and that often requires research too. How do horses work? How does agriculture work? How do whatever? How does your magic system work?
All right. So when we're going to talk about history and writing history or alternative history, which is sort of the subject for today, but I guess with people, if you guys want to ask us questions about any sort of research, certainly we'll talk about it to anybody who's participating right now. But since you mostly write history and alternative history, what do you see as the biggest problems when you read other people's history that really make you just go, why hasn't this person done their research?
Lack of consistency is probably the biggest thing, and also not understanding how history works. Now, if you take let's take a convenient punching bag for that, and that's Tolkien. All right, almost everybody likes Tolkien. There are a few people who really don't, but and I'm talking about the books now, not necessarily the movies, but a lot of people like Tolkien. Great, he is a linguist. He writes according to a specific style, and you take that or leave it. But his history is terrible. It doesn't make any sense. The thousands of years pass. Countries fade away, which makes no sense. They remain the same for hundreds of years.
Right. No technological advancement, nothing. Yeah.
Right. Gondor is the same in the Third Age largely as it was in the Second Age, and they're 3,400 years apart. Okay. China, which has a history that long, is very different 3,400 years later. If you look at Three Emperors, then you look at, I don't know, Manchu. They're probably not quite 3,400 years apart, but I mean that just proves the point. So Tolkien doesn't understand history. Another example that also deserves some small amount of beating is James Blish. James Blish's Cities in Flight, right?
Mm-hmm.
His model for history is Untergang des Abendlandes, Decline of the West. Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, Untergang des Abendlandes. Okay. Well, Spengler is a late 19th, early 20th century historian who suggested that all history could be modeled on cycles, that every culture goes through a certain set of cycles, and it always ends the same, badly. And so all the cultures in Cities in Flight, which is 4 books, which last from the 20th century to the end of time, which is, I don't know, some number of centuries ahead, all the cultures go through the same patterns. That's his hobby horse, is the Oswald Spengler. So as a result, everything gets modeled like that. Nothing breaks from it because he believes or he decides that Spengler is right. And unfortunately, that narrows his portrayal. But also, it kind of doesn't make any sense. But he makes other stuff up. He makes up anti-gravity and he makes up anti-Agathics, which is...
I remember I read it when I was in high school, and all I remember is cities literally flying through the air.
Flying around, yeah.
Literally.
Yeah, and it makes sense up to a point, and then you look at it and it becomes absurd because he's trying to model this philosophical presentation of how history works, and it just doesn't work.
We were talking before we started recording about how when you're trying to put a person in a historical light, you have to take into consideration what happened earlier in their life as well. What was going on 20 years before the story begins. Can you expand on that?
Sure. Thank you for that. Thank you for the softball. Um, I like to think about a historical period in terms of a frame. If you are, let's say 1850. All right. So the story's set in 1850 or 1860. That makes it easier. Beginning of the Civil War. That gives you something to hang it on. In 1860, the people who are in the middle of society are people between the ages of, say, 20 and 50. Okay? So they were born between 1810 and 1840. What did they experience? Well, the oldest of them will remember a time before the Industrial Revolution. But the youngest of them never knew a world that didn't have the telegraph, the railroad, mechanized agriculture, that is to say, the cotton gin, the harvester. Um, so all of them has a sort of shared experience, and that's just technology. All of them in America would have experienced a world where slavery was common in some parts of it. Never knew a time that it wasn't there. Never knew a time when there wasn't a United States. Now, if the story is set in 1760, none of those things are present. Guys who were born between 1710 and 1740 would remember a time when smallpox and cholera were rampant. Would remember a time when England had a Stuart king, Stuart queen actually. Would remember the Jacobites. Remember the Stuart Hanover fight. Would know about Indian raids, which were largely gone by 1760. But they'd remember a time when Indian raids happened. Whenever you think about whenever you think about a historical period, you need to think about what things are common. And of course, there's this sort of as you know, Bob problem where as you know, Mike. The as you know, Bob problem is the need to describe something which the characters in the story would never describe because it's common to them. And how you introduce things as commonplace without going to the extent of describing everything that the characters themselves wouldn't describe is a very difficult conundrum. But you have to think about what things are common to them. Do they all wear hats? Do they have indoor plumbing? Do they know about this technology or that technology? That's an important framing that you have to sort of understand.
Yeah, so that's how you help develop your characters' personalities as well, because sometimes you need to think about how they got there and what was their life like before this time, instead of just dumping them down in the middle of this and thinking they're all going to think alike. And that's something I do see sometimes in some of these.
And don't think like modern people.
Yes.
Also a classic problem. 1632 gets around that by taking a bunch of modern people and throwing them in. It gives us a view, and we all cheat like that.
I'm reminded somehow of Rip Van Winkle right when you say that, because Rip Van Winkle is a story that starts before the American Revolution. He goes to sleep and he wakes up, the American Revolution has happened and the country has changed so much in 20 years that he doesn't even understand it.
Right. It's a different framed context than the characters were.
Right. And sometimes you need to take your characters and realize they might have lived through it, but it's still very different for them and they just can't understand it.
Yeah. No, I was a student in Europe a frighteningly long time ago now. I was a student in Europe in '79, and then went back as a tourist. 5 years later. Then the last time we were there was 2009, so that's 30 years. And there were things that were present and visible, and people who were walking the streets in 1979 who were largely gone by 2009. Thus, a completely different experience. And I thought about that, about what the people who were in mainstream society, who were between, say, 20 and 60, because people live longer, between 20 and 60, who were walking around in 2009. Some of them, of course, weren't born in 1970, and they have this whole different shared experience. A lot of people who were older adults in 1979 experienced the Second World War close up and personal, sometimes as children, sometimes as young adults, sometimes as participants.
I got a couple of questions here I want to go over with you. First, Kevin Morley asks, when pulling from history to support your story, do you rely on real historical figures to interact with your main character, or historical figures restrained and never cross paths? Do you tie your main character with events and mention prominent persons? I can answer that from my book, but what's your answer?
It depends.
Yes.
Well, let's take an example, so I can show a cover, right? All right. This is an alternate history novel set in the west coast of America, an America that doesn't have any United States in it, and it's between 1816 and 1906. The principal characters that the story is built around are fictional. One of them eventually becomes the governor of Novaya Rossiya, of New Russia. He's completely fictional. Gyatso is fictional, but he meets Brigham Young. He meets members of the Astor family. He meets Mark Twain, Sam Clemens. He meets there's a Russian British double agent named John Sherwood, who turns out to be this wonderful character, and he wanders through the story a couple of different times. Emperor Norton, of course, he's not Emperor Norton. Joshua Norton is in the story, but his son, who didn't exist, is also in the story. So I invented a son for him because he isn't crazy. He doesn't become Emperor Norton. He's a merchant. So I use both real historical characters and fictional ones. But the fictional ones, they have to fit the theme, as we discussed. For the real ones, I feel obliged to read up on them and understand what they're like. What was Brigham Young like? What is Sam Clemens like in person? I read a big long biography of him, which was very enjoyable. And about there's a book about his round the world trip in the 1870s, which he did largely to get money back. But I read that so that I had a feel for what he was like, and he was fun to write. But that was a lot of there were starts and stops that I had to sort of learn to decide how he would react and how he would speak.
Well, if I could pitch in here, and I just changed the background to show the cover of my book. The book is Big Stick, which is a steampunk story with Teddy Roosevelt and Mark Twain and Harriet Tubman. And I had tremendous fun reading up on them first. And the best thing about doing the research first is it gave me tremendous ideas. Because if you read the histories and the biographies, you can get all kinds of things that may not have occurred to you beforehand. And then whenever I needed a background character, like I needed a scientist, I did research and found an actual scientist from the time. And the advantage of doing all this is I could read up on them and get their biography, and I didn't have to create a backstory for them. There was already a backstory, and that made them real. It made them because they are real. And I thought that kind
sometimes there's no backstory at all.
Again?
The backstory is missing, so you get to write it.
Yes.
I'll show another book. So I have a series which is about mesmerism, and in it Charles Dickens appears. He appears in the first one, and then in the second one, his son Charlie Dickens appears, and in the third one, which I'm working on, Charlie Dickens's oldest daughter, Mary Angela Dickens, appears. There's a 3-page biography on a Dickens website about her. There's a page and a half on Wikipedia. There's nothing else. I know almost as much as there is to know about Mary Angela Dickens. So the rest is up to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a historical character with a backstory that I have learned so that I have it part of the writing. And then I can model her however I see fit. Who's going to argue with me?
Well, that I agree. That's one of the advantages I had that I really enjoyed. Someone else pointed out Ragtime is another good example of a story where they use real people and tie them into it and make it very realistically.
Well, we just recently finished watching The Man in the High Castle, which is an alternate history, a very, very spooky, frightening one. And many of the characters in that book are fictional, like John Smith and Rufus Sewell's character is fictional. But a lot of the other characters, a number of the other characters are real. And of course, it's based on a one event historical change, which is the assassination of Franklin Roosevelt in January 1933 in Florida. That almost happened. You do TR, he gets an assassination attempt, which was stopped by the speech in his pocket, right? So whenever you have historical characters, always these what if turning points. My rule on history, by the way, is you get one of those. One of them. You change others, you're cheating.
No, yeah. One change that sets the world off in a different direction, and which is what I used to. How do you decide how reliable your sources are? Or how do you decide, when you have to take into consideration, obviously all histories have biases.
Um, don't depend on Wikipedia. Um, history, historiography is something that changes over time. And if you want to read about, let's say you're going to read about Nazi Germany, well, a lot of people, including my buddy Rob Sawyer, who just did Oppenheimer Alternative.
Right, I just read that. Yes.
Yeah, he approached me and he said, I'm doing something and I'm interested in something about Nazi Germany. And he gave me some details about what he was doing. And I think not all of it made it into the book because he changed his mind about what he wanted to do, or it's another book. And he said, well, I picked up Schirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And I said, no, don't do that. It's terrible. It's 60 years old. It's obviously biased because Schirer was, he was on the spot. He has a right to be biased but you have to read the bias into the writing. So you want to read about Hitler, read Ian Kershaw, who's 50 years newer. So you have to be aware that there is more and more new scholarship. The more we know, the more we can know. If it was 20 years ago, you'd read Alan Book's Hitler Studied Tyranny, or you'd read Thomas's book, or you read, there's a whole bunch of. So I don't want to say don't rely on anything that's too old, because there's some perfectly good old sources. Read Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror, but don't only read Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror. Read Wedgwood's 30 Years War, but don't only read that, because there's lots of new scholarship on the 30 Years War.
It sounds like we're telling people to do a lot of homework, but in a sense you have to if you don't want people to throw your book across the table.
I think you have to do enough. You have to make sure that it's satisfactory. It has a satisfactory quantity of verisimilitude. In other words, it's real enough. There use some 75-cent words. Yeah, it has to be real enough in order to satisfy real historians. But as you know, Bob, as you know, Michael, no matter what you write about, whether it's science or history or language, someone will come up to you at a con and tell you what you got wrong. And it always, on the other hand, it means they read your book. So
something.
But yeah, you have to be satisfied that you're 90% right. Eric Flint, who I write with, has this standing comment where he says, "This is vague is good." If you can't be sure about a subject, don't be sure about it. Skirt it. Try not to make everything hang upon your interpretation of some historical subject.
What are good resources for finding out just daily life? Let's say you're writing about a person who lives in 1815. They're nobody famous whatsoever, and they're someone who lives in a city. Where do you go to find out what life was like at that time?
Well, it depends on how much detail you need. I always start with a general history. If you want to read about America during the colonial era, read Andrews, which is 80 years old. But it makes sure that you know the names, places, dates, things. If I say 1815 to you, what's the biggest city in America in 1815?
New York?
Philadelphia.
Oh, Philadelphia. Okay.
So,
yeah, see, I didn't know.
What makes New York big? The Erie Canal, right? So, I think Boston is bigger than New York. I know Philadelphia is, but Baltimore is big. Charleston is big. New York is going to be big, but it isn't big yet. It isn't that big yet. So, but you have to know all the simple stuff before you start trying to decide what the validity of a historical setting is. You should read the background story, and that means not relying on pop history, but reading the serious stuff. I've actually read a whole book on the Whig Party. Don't read the book on the Whig Party. It was more than you need to know. But when I go and read, I'm trying to think of an example. I go to read, say, a Jackson biography. I already know enough about his Andrew Jackson, his political setting, to be able to understand what life was like in that era. So I always start with the general history. It doesn't hurt. If you don't know the basics, then you can't understand the details.
Wouldn't a source from the time be better than someone else is asking? Marianne is asking. Wouldn't a source from the time be better than a modern source?
Not necessarily, because of course it doesn't have perspective, or distance. It often has a bias, which there's no such thing as unbiased history, but less biased history is more a function of scholarship from later ages. If you want to read 18th century England, if you want to read a historian's account from then about the history of England, you can read Tobias Smollett, but I wouldn't recommend it because he was an ardent, let me see if I get this right. He was an ardent Whig, government Whig. So he was against a whole bunch of reform things. And he certainly believed the Jacobites were devils from hell because they're Catholic. Yeah.
So yeah, don't necessarily rely on the
right. But if you read Macaulay from 100 years later, you're not guaranteed to get. He's not guaranteed to give you the unpolished source. So go read Jeremy Black because he's an excellent, relatively modern historian who's done the homework for you, and then he's got a bibliography. He can tell you what he read. I'll read Webb's History of England, which is a general history and doesn't really have an axe to grind. And then you'll find out that he left some things out, put some things in, and then you can go and decide what parts you want.
Suppose you're writing a fantasy story and someone else has a question along these lines. And we're talking about the Lord of the Rings, you made that example earlier. Suppose you don't want the technology to advance. How can you explain that? You know, how do you want, can magic halt technology, for instance? But even then magic would advance, wouldn't it?
Sure, I would think so. I think that if you have humans who are innovative and inventive, and you have enough time, things change. Things just change. The counterexample is here. Let's bring up the third round. Let's talk about Ayn Rand. She wrote a short novel called Anthem, which is all about individualism versus collectivism. You know, the usual sort of. But she suggests that how you keep a society stable, and this can't work for over a long period of time. You keep society stable by simply suppressing inventions and technology. If what you want is everybody to still have the candle, if somebody invents an incandescent light, you suppress it.
Isn't that does that sort of explain the Dark Ages in some way? Because a lot of science was suppressed during that period, and maybe that's why society didn't progress that long. I've heard that theory. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, no, Charles Homer Haskins' Renaissance of the 12th century. There is no Dark Ages. Yes and no. It took a long time to reinvent aqueducts, but things like advances in agriculture continued to happen. The thing that suppressed the advancement of technology to a large extent was the Black Death, because people were too busy dying to, invent a better plow. The problem is that the Middle Ages are badly characterized, and that whole idea of the Middle Ages was invented by people right after the Middle Ages to distance themselves from it. But in fact, it doesn't look like that. Things continue to move along. During the Dark Ages, Western Europe imported Arabic mathematics, double entry bookkeeping, navigation, all these things were adopted from other societies. If you want an interesting look at how technology advances as a result of something like exploration, when we recommend Charles Mann's books, particularly 1493, where he talks about how his great example is how the guano mines of Chile caused the potato famine in Ireland, because all of these different societies and all these different geographies wind up mixing together because of the so-called discovery of the New World. No, it's very, very hard for something to. I saw the question.
Yeah, about reading different points of view. Talking about how sometimes it's important to read the bad points of view just to see what other people are thinking at the time.
Sure, and that's why Shirer's books continue to sell. I think that's there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to be aware of the biases. You have to have your eyes open about what the author is trying to give you. I don't have other than Shire, I don't have a good example to hand.
Well, let's talk about other types of research while we're here and while we still have some time, because we've been talking mostly about history, but there's also science, and law. Anything you're a specialist in. If I write a story about a horse and someone's riding a horse, I should know what it feels like to ride a horse if I want to describe it.
Of course.
Yeah, and too often writers write about things they don't know, and they don't get that's what pulls you out of a story quicker, or a movie too.
Sure. Though that can be exhausting if you feel the need to be exhausted. I was talking to Harry Turtledove about something like this, and I said, I found this great book which describes all the taverns of Boston in the colonial era. So I know where they all are, and I know what all the names are. And he said, good, mention 2. Just 2. Don't mention more than 2.
Yeah. You don't want to bore your readers. You don't want to do all the research and say, now that I've done all this research, I'm going to let you all know all this research I've done. That's
the 10% rule. The iceberg is.
Yeah.
You'd be satisfied that you've done enough research to write about something, but you don't need to show it all, especially in the first page.
But also, research doesn't just mean writing books; it means talking to the right people. If in one of my previous novels, I had the FBI getting involved, going after somebody, so I actually went online and said, "Does anyone know an FBI agent?" And people, nope. There's enough connections now with the internet. Someone contacted me, and I was able to talk to her. And she didn't want to be quoted. She didn't want anyone to say who she was, but she answered, "Here's what our procedure would be." I've had people call me and say, Mike, if someone gets arrested in Pennsylvania, how does it work? And I have to explain it to them. And that the thing is, people like to give their expertise. Never be shy is what I'm trying to say to everybody about asking someone who's an expert, because sometimes they're thrilled to give you their expertise, and you thank them in the back of the book, and they're so happy, and then they buy a book and tell all their friends to buy the book. So that works too.
Yeah, I'm in the 1632 universe. A number of times people have approached the Granville Gazette editors and said, I want to do a story about Freemasonry. And what happens is they don't actually know anything about it. They only know what they read on the internet.
Or in Dan Brown novel.
Well, yeah, which are very...
Yeah, I know.
But if you want to know about how Freemasonry worked in the 18th century, you can ask me, because I'm the historian for the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, which is the oldest Grand Lodge in the country. I know a lot about it. In fact, I have a whole website for it. So if you ever want to know anything about Freemasonry, I told Gail Martin this. I said, if you ever want to know anything about Freemasonry, probably if I don't know it, I know where to look it up. Mm-hmm. So I have that kind of resource, and that is a very particular narrow slice of historical research.
Marianne Moore points out again that even cops, scientists, lawyers, we all have biases too, so you need to take that into consideration.
Oh,
yeah. Always keep that in mind with everybody.
Yeah, and there's always going to be somebody who's going to come after you and accuse you of bias. I've certainly been accused of bias, and nowadays, I'm sad to say that we belong to a demographic that gets criticized for having inherent bias that we cannot avoid. I don't know what to say about that, except that I try to think about what I'm writing.
Leslie do you have any tips for organizing your research? Do you have a files? Do you highlight things, or you just take notes? Oh, he's going to show us something now.
Yeah, I have folders and books. I try to keep an organized list of the things I've read, and whenever I take notes from a book, I always put the name of the book. Sorry, I don't know to adjust that again. I always put the name of the book and the author, and if there's a call number, like a Library of Congress number, I put it on the top of the page of notes. One of the things I backed on Kickstarter is something called a Rocket Book Orbit, which is a thing that lets you handwrite notes, and then it'll convert it to a PDF, convert it to text. I don't know how that's going to work, but I decided I'd give it a try. But I do a lot of handwritten notes. I write a lot of pieces of paper with writing on them, and try not to spend a lot of time transcribing. But I have lots and lots of pages
And that works for you, though, right? I mean,
It does.
everyone should find their own way of doing it, of
It
course.
does. You can also, print something out and make notes on it.
Do you list your sources in the back of your books?
Not generally, but
Because I noticed that Robert Sawyer does that all the time.
he does. I was my very first novel series at Tor. I wanted to have an appendix and a glossary, and my editor dissuaded me from it. So Bane, we list the characters, but we don't really list any kind of historical background material.
Do you like it when they do that?
I prefer if they did that. Actually, I like to be able to read what the author has read. I think nowadays it's sort of stuff you put on your website.
The only thing I did in the back of my book was I had an appendix that said, these are real people. And in case you were reading this book and didn't realize it, these are the real people in the book, so people could do the research. But I didn't list where I had read up on them.
Oh yeah, I did that
Some people like that.
in City by the Bay. I listed all the characters and indicated which ones were real and which ones I'd made up.
Yeah, and people really liked that when they read my book. They commented it was great to see that, because then it just made the story much more fun. So I'm glad that you do it too.
Yeah, I've written novels where where people read them and they said, "Well, this guy, he doesn't make any sense at all." And then they'll go on Wikipedia and find out it's a real person.
Do you use maps? Have you used maps, or do you like to put maps in your books?
Oh,
Or does that help?
yeah. Some of them I draw myself. For the Bane books, we have a guy who does the map. Mike Knopf does the map.
But I mean, when you're doing research, I mean, like.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I have a one.
Well, while you're looking for that, I just want to comment
Right here.
that one thing I always hate is when I
my
read
map
a story,
of North America.
and it gives you an idea of how long of a travel as well, because that's one of the things I always hate, when they can they go from one place to another and it's only been a week or something, and that doesn't make sense.
Especially given the Bane training, we have a good idea of how far apart things are, how long it takes to get from point A to point B. There's a great line in 1776, my favorite musical, where she says, John, why'd you come home to Boston? If you left tonight, you'd be home in 8 days.
That's so easy. Yes, of course. You're right. People don't always take into consideration all those sorts.
Yeah, I have a thing called a vademecum, which is an 18th century atlas, which is basically strip maps, like the things you used to be able to get from AAA, which shows all the stops and where the inns are, and where the roads are good and where the roads are bad, and where you have to cross rivers. And
I used something like that when I was doing the Teddy Roosevelt book, because he had to get from New York to Washington, D.C., and I needed to know how he would do it and what towns he would pass along the way and stuff. And
go by
I like doing that kind of research. It was fun,
Yeah, for my mesmerism books, I found Baedeker books, which are travel guides, and I have a what's the name of it? There's a specific railway guide, the European railway guide, which tells you where the stations are and what they're called and how often the trains run there. And if there's no information, again, you can kind of make it up. But for example, the line from Paris to Marseille was very new in the 1850s. There are no trains at all in India until the 1850s. They're just starting to appear. In the 1830s and 1840s, there are no trains. There are no trains in India at all, which means getting from Bombay to Calcutta is insanely hard, because there's just no easy way to do it. And India turns out to be big. I hope you're aware of that.
Another question I think is a good one. Can you think of an example of a mistake in an American historical fiction that you've encountered or let me just broaden that a bit. Can you think of something that just made you stop reading because you were just so frustrated with it because it was so wrong?
There was a novel.
So blatant, yes.
There was a novel about the fall of the Templars that I wanted to read to see how somebody viewed it when I was writing a novel about the Templars, A Song in Stone, and she got the date wrong. The date that Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake in 1314, the last Grand Master of the Templars, and she had it in 1310. It's like,
no, 99% of the people would not catch that, though.
Yeah, you think that sometime between the composition and the publication, that somebody would catch that. Having an excellent copy editor is a big advantage. For the first Mesmerism novel, I had a terrific copy editor, a guy named Richard Shealy, who goes by Shecky. He's a great guy and really knows his stuff. And he knows what he knows and knows what he doesn't know, and he knows how to look things up. He has good, as they say, good Google foo. But that's the thing that struck me the most. There's a historical novel called For Want of a Nail, which reverses the Battle of Saratoga and gives the British the victory. I didn't do that for City by the Bay. I have a different fulcrum point, and the initial stuff is very very thorough, and then it just goes it goes off the rails quickly, and people are just not like they would be. And I struggled through it because I wanted to see where he wound up, and it was just crazy. I don't have another example.
How about in a movie or a TV show? Because I think it comes more often when I'm watching movies or TV shows, especially things. To me, I'm a lawyer. I see things and I go, that's not how it works. You know,
It's not how this works. It's not how any of this works.
Yes.
Yeah, Dan Brown. Dan Brown's view of Freemasonry is just what's the last one? The lost symbol. Of course, it all happens one night. It doesn't make any sense. None of it makes any sense.
I give Dan Brown credit for this. He knows how to keep the story moving. And when I've read the Dan Brown novels, I don't read them for character development because there is none. And I don't read them for the plot as much as I read it for learning how to keep my story moving, because he's very good about that.
Yeah, the only Dan Brown novel that I would actually recommend is Angels and Demons. I thought that's the one where with the ambigrams, the words that turn upside down, that takes place in Rome, and they planted like 4 bombs. I thought that was gripping. I thought that was true.
It was better than the movie.
Oh, was the movie not very good?
Yeah, the movie treated us like we were too stupid to figure out what was going on, and it spoon-fed us everything so there were no surprises by the end of the movie.
I had that feeling about the Da Vinci Code book. I thought I was smarter than the puzzle.
Yes, you could figure that out quickly.
And the lost symbol just that's one I wanted to throw across the room.
I haven't read that one.
Oh, it's
all right. Another question. Any suggestions about finding taverns and inns in the U.S. during the 1820s? Apparently, someone's writing a book in the 1820s, and how much it cost, and meals, and things like that. You know, where would you go for that?
I have a book on it. I'll have to find it. Send me.
Or you could post it here. You know, when you get it, or send Walter an email. I'm sorry,
send me an email. I have a book on early American taverns, which I found someplace. And I bought from A Libris. There's a Libris and Abe books. I'm a big fan because you can find lots of things, and you just you buy them and then you read them.
Here's a question, and this
I have a book on it. There's a book.
This is more directed to you.
Yeah, let me just say, there's Drake's book on taverns in Boston is very good. If you want Boston, that's easy. But all early United States, you need a more general book, and I do have
one. Someone's asking a more personal question towards you over here in the chat. Actually, is there a difference when you're writing in someone else's alternate universe versus one where you decided on the changes? You know, when you're writing the 1632 universe, you're kind of limited. And we were talking about this before we even started about doing shared universes. Does that limit you? Do you feel, or do you like that?
If I didn't like writing in 1632, I wouldn't write it. It has a very compelling and very detailed backstory. People have no idea how much research it is.
Explain what it is for anyone who doesn't understand.
Okay. 1632 is a novel by Eric Flint, written 20 years ago. The premise of which is a small town in West Virginia, and its surrounding 5-mile radius is transported physically to the middle of the 30 Years' War in Thuringia. So needless to say, their situation improves because they're no longer in West Virginia. I can only help. So West Virginia can send me a smack. But they have to deal with the idea of having 3,500 regular people stuck into this extraordinary situation where they're cut off from everything they knew, but they know how things come out. And there are something like 8 million words written in the universe right now. It's 26 novels. Mine is somewhere in the high 20s. There is so much material written and figured out. We have it plotted out through about 1640, and a year from now we'll have it plotted out through 1640. It'll be different from what we have now, but we know sort of what's coming up next. So if you want to know about, if you want to use a historical character, it has to fit in with what's already been written, but you can go off on your own. I got to do a lot with Richelieu because we'd only peripherally used it. But if you want to use an uptimer, a character from the original creation, there's a genealogical database. They know who every single one of them is, and you have to check them out of the database and use it. So there's a lot of constraints, and there are people who know stuff that you can't imagine that they know it, like what the weather patterns were in the North Atlantic in the 1630s. Yeah, there's somebody who knows that. Yeah. So sometimes it's like, you want to do this or that, and they sorry, you can't do this or that. But sometimes there's enormous resources, and they give you ideas that you hadn't thought of. Plus, it's a very supportive, very structured environment. Unlike, we talked about Thieves' World, about how inconsistent it is. 1632 is an incredibly internally consistent universe. So
there's a question about your background. Did you study history in a formal setting? Were you self-taught?
My degree is in history.
Yeah, kind of figured.
Bowdoin College, 1981, history and German language. So I've been a history guy since the beginning. I've always been a big history fan, but that's what I did in college.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left, so if anyone has any other questions they want to ask, just about research and anything, there's a question there. You can type the answer later, and we get back to that. You can give her your email for that.
You're right about take all genealogical records with a grain of salt. That's true. But the genealogical records we've made up for our uptimers are absolutely accurate. We created them for the purpose.
The fictional genealogical records that you're using. Yes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the further back you go, which isn't all that far back, it immediately becomes muddy. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Yeah, I edited a series of fantasy stories called The Tales of Vertanis, which is a shared world as well, but we were not quite as picky as 1632 is. Yeah, I let people have a lot more freedom in creating new lands and things. So if you're writing for an anthology, make sure that you know what you're doing, obviously if someone's doing that, but that's a subject for a different panel. All right, do we have any other questions we want to ask? Or Walter, do you have anything else you want to add that I haven't asked you about that you think we need to talk about?
No, I think you let me talk at length. I'm fascinated by history and by historical novels, not just fantasy science fiction, but regular historical novels. USA is my favorite 20th century novel, and that's clearly a historical novel. Turns out history is more interesting than fiction. And when you go and research something like Theodore Roosevelt, I mean, the number of different turning points in his life are the extraordinary. The number of things that could have happened to him. I
loved studying him. He's one of my favorites. So when I wanted to write about him.
He's my favorite president.
Now, the thing about history too is history doesn't have to be believable in some ways. If you took the year 2020 and wrote a fictional story about it with our current president, and then a television type history president, and then the virus, and then the murder hornets, someone would say, well, that's not very believable, but it's true. Sometimes your fiction has to be more believable than history really is.
Well, I argue that if a historical novel about the American Revolution, as described, all the things that happen, all the narrow escapes, all the lucky breaks, all the people who died just at the right time or survived, I don't think an editor would buy it. The fact that them losing is more plausible than them winning.
One last question is, what parts of modern history for, say, the 1960s today, do you think future writers will be most interested in creating an alternate history? There's a lot of stories about what if the South had won the Civil War, what would be the future what ifs?
Well, the Kennedy assassination continues to have legs.
Yes. Stephen King did one on that. Yes.
Right. Well, Boys from Brazil. There's a lot of things about Kennedy. Even Watchmen touches on Vietnam. which becomes a state. uh, uh, but I think the war on terror, the so-called war on terror, is probably ample fodder. I think you'll see a lot of things written about the time from 9/11 on, the way Tom Clancy basically monetized the Cold War. You, uh, there was a lot written about the balloon going up in Europe. Hackett's the Third World War. I mean, I was in Europe in 79, 80, and there was this fear that we were going to get an invasion that nobody in America knew about. When Tito died, there was this thing about whether we were going to have a hot war in Europe. So I think the post 9/11 world is going to get fiction about what's going on and what and I'm sure there's already a body of it. Thanks to Amazon Publishing, there are lots of bad novels about the post 9/11.
All right. Well, before we leave, Walter, tell everyone where they can find you and where they can find your books, and give them your webpage and all that stuff.
Yeah, my website is not currently up and functioning, but it's been out of order for a while. But all my books are available on Amazon and elsewhere, and in fine bookstores near you. My current things in print are Harmony Light and Elements of Mind, which are my mesmerism books. City by the Bay, which is the Russian California book. A Song in Stone, which is about the Templars. My 4 Darkwing hard science fiction novels are available from the Baen ebook library. 2 novels from 1632 universe, and I did Council of Fire, which is a show that cover. Great Dave Seeley cover, which is set in America with magic. So found better sources of books everywhere.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Don't go anywhere. We're going to stop the recording, but Steve, please hang around. All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.